It's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon from Nairobi. It's a very cold morning in Nairobi. We're experiencing climate change as we sit, and it's, you know, playing out in front of our eyes. But it is wonderful to see some of the distinguished panel members who I've known for a long time. It's great to see you once again. People like Philip, perhaps, Professor Kijazi. Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you today. So I've been given 10 minutes to talk about research, science, and technology needs for addressing the challenges of the Paris Agreement. And as you heard, I work at the African Academy of Sciences, where we are really looking at growing, one of our programs, the one that I manage, growing leadership in science across the continent. And the climate change and the environment are one of the strategic pillars of our strategy at the African Academy of Sciences. Right, so here we are with the historic climate agreement in Paris from 2015. Those are all of the things that are the main issues that came out, but very importantly, it's the second one, the struggle to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. And as my colleague Philip mentioned, most parts of our region in East Africa are already beyond that. So what do we need to do to sort of mitigate the issues that are really pertinent for us as Africans? Now, these are the countries that are actually signatory countries, and I like using maps because they really tell an excellent story just in one look. So as you can see, most of the African region are not quite signatories yet. But we are disproportionately affected. This is something that we say all the time, but I think it's a good message to keep putting across that what exactly does this mean? Even though we're only contributing about 3.6 of global emissions, the impacts are greatly felt on African countries and even in our region because of our dependency on natural resources and the climate cycles and a weak adaptive capacity. So I'd like to show a couple of, these are called density adjusted cartographs, just multiplying the area of the map according to an index that's being measured. Here we're looking at the global distribution of wealth and really seeing that there's very little wealth in Africa. If you consider wealth in the traditional sense of, you know, wealth, GDP, and so on and so forth, compared to other regions of the world. And obviously, the impacts of climate change, it's a completely opposite picture for our region. So it's important to see where does the Paris Agreement link to sustainable development. So out of these 17 development goals, we're looking at SDG 13, which really has been mentioned in the previous talk about taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. However, all of these SDGs are interconnected. Now, we have seen Africa's response in the policy realm for many years, starting from the Libreville Declaration, the African Ministers of Health and Environment joint statement, several statements, CLIN, its creation, to the creation of the African Climate Policy Center, and the launch of the Climate Research for Development initiative. Now, the initiative from CR4D, the Climate Research for Development, is really set the ball rolling to address a very pertinent gap between research and policy and in the middle of their climate services. And that gap is still very much there. So there are gaps in knowledge around climate change. Philip has mentioned some of the uncertainties in models. One thing we see, and the models are showing something different. There's not much knowledge between the links between climate change and socioeconomic factors, and then how society will develop and respond to adapt. All of these issues still need to be addressed in terms of science for Africa, our region Africa, and also for East Africa. So a key policy question is, what should we do differently to address socioeconomic concerns across Africa, given what we can expect from climate change. So we may have the science, but the important thing is how do people respond, and how does the scientific community address the issues that will affect the people on the continent and in our region. So I think we're all familiar, I think many of us are familiar with the CR4D initiative, but just in case there are those of us of the 350 participants who might not know, this is an African-led initiative supported by a partnership between the African Climate Policy Center, which is based at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It's a partnership with AMCOMET, the WMO, and the Global Framework for Climate Services. And it was an outcome of the Africa Climate Conference in 2013 that was held in Professor Kijazi's country, in Arusha. So the main aim of CR4D was to strengthen the links between science and research, to actually address that gap that I've mentioned between research and policy. Now, through CR4D, Africa has been able to select the priorities for research, and they fall in under these three main areas: gaps in foundational climate science, also improve understanding of the impacts, information, translation, and communication. That's discussing all the things that have been mentioned before about seasonal predictions, looking at different sectors of society and how climate impacts them. And then the important one, the third, is engagement with policy and decision-making communities. Now, I work at the African Academy of Sciences, and on behalf of the ACPC, the AAS was granted the task of managing the research grants that are from the CR4D initiative. So 21 awards were made to excellent scientists from across the continent in June 2019 for a 1 year, was now extended to about almost a 1.5 year program of work to actually address these scientific priorities that have been listed for Africa. So this is a partnership with the AAS, the African Climate Policy Center, and the UK Department for International Development, DFID. So I think I've said that one. So there's several initiatives really looking around one of the things that has been done in the realm of research in supporting the growth of leaders in science. I mean, we realize that there's a massive gap. Researchers to contribute, for example, to IPC processes, to act as reviewers, to act as authors, and generally to gather the evidence of climate change in the sectors across the continent. So there's been a long initiative. CR4D, of course, is the main one at the moment. And in the past, the African Academy of Sciences has also trained almost 100 postdoctoral and postmasters scientists, again from across the continent, in areas of climate change. And this is just basically a map showing their distribution, where they come from, and I think we are at a point on the continent where that song that there is no capacity is actually begun to be addressed. There is capacity. There are many postdoctoral level scientists who are out there. But I think we need to start thinking also of addressing the environment for them to work in the area of climate change. We mentioned earlier on another speaker as well, involving our regional climate centers in really supporting research, so that these can be hubs where researchers can be visiting fellows from one region to another and really grow that space where climate scientists are working in the space of sustainable development. Now, one of the important things that needs to be done, it's been done already for NCR4D, is in the area of setting the research priorities for Africa's climate change agenda. Now, I've actually lost one slide in there. I do apologize that. But I'd just like to tell you about some of the work that we've done and looking at how best to set a research priority agenda when there's limited data, as is the situation in much of our continent and definitely in our region. One of the things that we're working on at the Academy is using techniques like wisdom of the crowd. If you gather enough people who have a good or strong opinion or knowledge about a topic and ask them what they think would be most important, gather all of that information together, you're quite likely to come up with a result that, you know, is probably quite near to the truth. Now, this methodology for doing research was actually initiated by a farmer who was at a fair and wanted to look at and wanted people to guess the weight of a prize bull. So he gathered all the farmers who came by his stand there and asked, could you guess the weight of this bull? And they were able, after, you know, almost 100 guesses, to guess the weight of that bull up to the nearest 0.1 of a pound. So this is how we are using the wisdom of crowds to set priorities for research in different areas of sustainable development at the Academy. Now, recently, as you're all aware, and as you know, I'm also sitting on the WMO task force for COVID. This is part of the WMO, an initiative of the WMO Research Board. We have a pandemic on hand, the COVID-19 pandemic across the continent. Now, the epidemic preparedness agenda setting began with an all-hands webinar that happened in March, which is a sort of kick-off meeting. And I'm giving this as an example of another possibility where science and technology can help bridge that gap between a research agenda and actually a policy agenda to say, okay, now we have a certain amount of funds or we have certain few opportunities, what can we do? What kind of expertise do we have out there? And how can they become engaged in the process of decision making on how to move activities forward? So following from the all hands webinar, where 275 scientists who work in the field of COVID research, but from all sectors. Some are from the health sector, some work in supply chain, some are just researchers, from all sorts of, there were climate scientists in there as well. So we hosted a webinar and to just start the common thinking. And then following the webinar, just to introduce the topic, we sent out a survey with listing all the possible priority areas specific for Africa. And then sent out a survey asking the respondents, as many as possible, about 844 respondents, to list what they think would be the highest, what they would give the highest priorities for research. Now, following that, with a summary of those priorities, we convened a group of experts to look at those priorities and group them together. So
Dr. Omumbo, wrap up, please, by
yes,
2 minutes.
Just 1 minute. To group them together. And then once those were grouped together, we were able to put out a call for funding across the continent. And I think we would like to really do at the moment, do a very similar thing also for climate change. And that process has already started at the Academy. So I'll leave it there. If anybody has any questions later on, please do feel free to ask me.